Thank you very much, Professor Jha. Next, Dr. David Finkelstein of the Center for Naval Analysis.
Hope you don't mind if I stand here.
Nope.
I think everybody will agree that Professor Jha's comments were terrific and a great start to this panel. Many thanks to Dean, Walter, and Friends at Heritage for the opportunity to be here today. You have a terrific Asia program, and I'm a fan. Needless to say, my comments today are strictly my own and don't represent the views of CNA, Center for Naval Analyses, or any of its sponsors. I was asked to comment on where I think Chinese foreign policy and defense policy is headed, especially in the wake of the 19th Party Congress. And I think you're going to find that the comments to follow are going to be remarkably complimentary of what Professor Jha has just offered us. But my bottom line is quite simple and straightforward. To wit, the 19th Party Congress will most likely validate and provide a political mandate to continue the general direction that Chinese foreign policy and defense policy has taken over the past few years. More of the same. But from my perspective of 30-plus years of China watching, more of the same is no longer more of the same. And I think that we can agree, as Professor Jha just did, that in the future, and we've seen in the recent past, that Chinese foreign policy and defense policy is taking directions that many of us are not quite used to seeing in the past. In fact, I would posit that in foreign affairs and defense policy, China is now firmly into what I call the post-Dengist era, meaning that many of China's previous policy approaches, preferences, predilections, and behaviors are today sometimes under scrutiny for continued relevance, have been adjusted in some cases, and perhaps seemingly been overturned. That's an open question. But in any event, I would say that Tao Guang Yang Hui is yesterday's news, and today's byword is activist and proactive. Arguably, Beijing's approach in the last few years to the South China Sea and East China Sea could be held up as a poster child for an activist China, just as OBOR could be as well. Now, it should not be surprising that China's foreign and defense policies are going in new directions, even if some of the specific policies are surprising. Now, we should not be surprised about new directions in foreign and defense policy for two reasons. The first, of course, is that Chinese national interests are changing and, in fact, expanding. Quite simply, a China with global economic interests is now a China with previously unheld global political interests and, very significantly, a China with new global security interests that Beijing has never before had to cope with or account for. When you are doing business, for example, in some of the world's worst neighborhoods, you have some new security challenges you have to deal with. And we all remember that in 2011, China had the largest number of foreign nationals that had to be evacuated from Libya, some 35,860, according to Xinhua. A second reason why the PRC foreign and defense policies have been going in new directions, and this has to do with the dual identity, I think, that Professor Jha talked about, is because of Beijing's changing self-assessment of its own role in the international order. The leadership of the CCP talk of China having entered an historic interregnum, a transitional moment on the road to great power status that requires them to rethink their place in the world and adjust their policies. And if you read the materials, the speeches that come out of the party, the PLA, and other places, you commonly read these quotes that, for example, that China is rapidly making the transition from merely being a big country, a daguo, to becoming a strong country, a changguo, and moving from the periphery of world events to the center of world events. So as a result, at least from where I've been sitting, reading and talking with my Chinese friends, it's pretty clear over the past few years that PRC foreign policy and defense policy elites have been engaged in rethinking China's role as an international actor, reconsidering what constitutes China's national security interests and their priorities, revisiting how the regime should reorganize itself internally to manage expanding national security and foreign policy interests, and most importantly, re-examining how and by what means and with what policies China should pursue its national security and foreign interests. So if there were one overarching characteristic of this post-Dengist Chinese external policy, whether external foreign economic policy, diplomacy, or defense policy, I think it would be this. And again, I'm echoing Professor Jia to a certain degree. More than ever before, China today seems quite prepared to proactively use, selectively, all the elements of national power to attempt to shape its external environment. Certainly close to home in Asia, but in some cases attempting to shape the international system. So where I'm in total agreement with Professor Jia, China is now a violent defender of the international system, but it is also attempting to shape that international system to achieve its own national security interests. And we could go through a long laundry list of examples. Jia already did it. You could talk about the creation of the AIIB, the One Belt, One Road. You could talk about Beijing's constant calls for a new security architecture in Asia, right? Very dissatisfied with that in East Asia. And on the soft power side, people could talk about the proliferation of Confucius Institutes or beefing up or rebranding PRC media outlets abroad, CCTV and some of what it has gone through. And while Beijing is also happy to use economic carrots to support its foreign policy objectives, we're also now at a point where Beijing is also using economic sticks to do that as well, and we've seen that with Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. Now, these are not qualitative, these are not judgments, right, wrong, good, bad. These are, in my view, empirical observations. And I fully expect that Beijing's policy activism, selectively using the elements of national power to achieve its means, this proactive approach to external affairs will continue after the 19th Party Congress. So what about defense and military affairs? We've also seen significant changes in approach over the past few years in defense and military affairs, changes that I suspect will also carry over into the 19th Party Congress. So in this post-Dengist era, given China's expanding national interests and the party's changing assessment of China's place in the international order, it seems that the roles and missions of the Chinese armed forces, the People's Liberation Army, PLA, and the party's expectations of the PLA are changing. As everyone here knows, for most of its existence, the PLA has been a homeland defense force charged with providing political protection to the CCP and securing China's borders, coastlines, and sovereignty. This has not changed. This will not change. These are core missions of the Chinese armed forces. But today, the party also wants a new kind of military, a military for a China with changing national security interests. The party wants a PLA, it would appear, that beyond being loyal to the CCP, is focused on warfighting, and a PLA that can go places and do things. The CCP leadership seems to want a PLA that can secure China's traditional and non-traditional security interests, not only close to home in the Asia-Pacific region, but selectively far, far beyond. And if there's any question about this, at least theoretical aspiration, you should look no further than the work report or from the 18th Party Congress, or the white paper that came out in 2015 that says that, quote, building a strong national defense and powerful armed forces that are commensurate with China's international standing and which meets the need of China's security and development interests is a strategic task of China's modernization. So quite simply, a policy statement saying a new type of PLA for a new type of China. And as I look back on this sort of crept up on this. This did not happen suddenly. Who in 2004, when Hu Jintao issued the PLA its new historic missions, who would have predicted that the Chinese Navy would have maintained a near constant operational presence off the Gulf of Aden that is almost a decade in running? That's a big development in the history of Chinese defense policy. Or that the PLA Navy would be asked to conduct and would conduct escort duty for Syrian chemical weapons. That's a huge development in the history of Chinese armed forces, or that the PLA Navy would now include Far Seas Protection, Yuanhai Huwei, as part of its Jinhai Fangyu, Near Seas Defense military strategy. And then talk about a post-Dengist development in military and foreign affairs. I would never have guessed 5, 6, 7 years ago that the Chinese today would be working on having their first military base on foreign soil in Djibouti, because that's what it is. It's a foreign military base. So one does wonder if in this post-Dengist period, the Dengist precept that China seeks no overseas military bases is by the wayside. Is this an exception? I don't know. But what the point here is that we're dealing with different policy approaches, policy decisions that we as observers of China, certainly I as an observer of China, have never dealt with before. And we could also talk about the clause in China's 2015 counterterrorism law that for the first time provides a domestic legal basis for dispatching Chinese forces abroad, Chinese counterterrorism forces under certain conditions that are not, that have nothing to do with the UN. So these are all open questions. And of course, most significant of all, as you're all keenly aware, for the past couple of years, the PLA has been launched into an unprecedented period of reorganization and reform. The objective, which is to enhance its ability to conduct joint operations in the maritime aerospace domains and in high-tech battle spaces such as cyber, outer space, and the electromagnetic spectrum. So we're dealing with a different PLA, supporting a different set of foreign policy and national security objectives at a time when, as Professor Jia said, China has dual identity, dual sets of interests, those of a developing country but those of an advanced country. And this is very dislocating for those of us who are trying to figure out where China is going to go. So let me just close and say that over the past few years, certainly since the 18th Party Congress or shortly before, we've been witnessing significant adjustments to how Beijing pursues its foreign interests. And I see no reason to believe that the upcoming 19th Party Congress will do anything but validate these changes or new approaches. I think we will continue to see a China that is willing to attempt to proactively shape its regional political, economic, and security environment and not just react to it. We'll see a China whose global economic interests come increasingly with global security interests and demand signals at home in China for the PLA and other elements of the Chinese party state to secure those expanding interests overseas. A China with a military that, in addition to continuing to modernize and reform, is going to be called upon to take on more expeditionary missions, both in the Asia-Pacific and beyond, and a post-Dengist China whose external policies are going to surprise people like me from time to time who thought over the years that they had figured it out. Because I stand here as a charlatan before you, telling you that I've never been less sure of what I think I understand is going on in China than I do today. So thanks for your comments, and thank you, Professor Jia, for those terrific introductory comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Walter. Let me echo Dave's comments about the success of your program here. And Professor Jia, thank you as always for a very illuminating introductory presentation to get our discussion going. Let me start by saying I generally would associate myself with Dave Finkelstein's comments about the 19th Party Congress. In terms of foreign policy and grand strategy, I think it will largely validate a trajectory that was set somewhere between 8, 9 years ago, if not further back. The one thing that might come out of this, and I'd be interested in Dave's comments later, that might come out of the 19th Party Congress is a much more visible and deliberate effort to reform the PLA, which we've heard about and read about, to create a war-fighting capability, combatant commands, and a political effort on the scale of our Goldwater-Nichols Act that would really change institutionally the PLA's capabilities, missions, authorities. And that is something that I think will accelerate after the 19th Party Congress, that one of the big reforms coming up. But I generally agree with Dave. This is a validation of a grand strategy or a set of efforts that have been in place. Let me also, just for context, add that everything Dave says is true and more. A permanent base in Djibouti, a first aircraft carrier, and so on and so forth. I would just add for context that Japan has had a joint base at Djibouti longer than China, operating constantly, that India has engaged in, this year will engage in unprecedented levels of cooperation with the U.S. Navy and the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces in the Malabar operation, conducting advanced anti-submarine warfare operations, not your usual search and rescue, pass and review naval exercises. And Japan's new interpretation of the Constitution explicitly allows more joint operations, not only with the U.S., but also Australia. So there's a lot happening. It's not a sort of linear Chinese movement, and the rest of Asia is passively watching. This is in a larger context, which I know Dave would agree with. I just wanted to add that. Now, I would like to pick up on one of the many interesting points that Professor Jha said, and that's this idea of China's split or dual identity, which I think is intriguing and accurate, and books could be written about it. I'd like to put on the table another kind of dual identity, and that is the dual identity of China as a rising power between its global interests and its regional interests. I think this goes a long way towards explaining Chinese strategy, but also the ambiguities or lack of clarity we sometimes see in it. Historically, at least in the last 2 centuries, rising powers have exhibited 2 lines of effort. One is generally free riding on the global system and the prevailing hegemonic power. And the second one is revisionist behavior in their own neighborhood, in their own region or sub-region. The United States did this. There was a reason that in London, American diplomacy in the 19th century was called jackal diplomacy. We came in for the kill in China and elsewhere after Britain fought the wars. We lived on the Royal Navy's protection of the sea. But in North America, and particularly vis-a-vis Mexico, we, using force and ideology, engaged in revisionist behavior to get the European powers out and secure our own future as a republic. We tried against Canada, it didn't work as well, but we don't like to remember that. But we certainly did in Mexico and Central America. Germany under Bismarck, again, free riding on British global power. Bismarck was all about not challenging Britain, but reordering Central Europe to create a Prussian superstate. And Japan had an alliance with Britain, and engaged from 1894 on until 1945 in revisionist behavior within its own neighborhood to consolidate its own hegemony within the region and expel potential challengers. So what China is doing today globally falls very much in that pattern of free riding, not entirely free riding, but that general pattern of free riding. And I think what China is doing in the region generally falls within that historical pattern of revisionism. So you can see in the free riding or global aspect some areas where China is beginning to start to support the system, as Professor Jha said. I think the Paris Agreement, although there was a lot less there than advertised by the previous administration, was nevertheless an example of Beijing trying, and in substantive ways, starting to form part of a global response to climate change, largely because people in China want to be able to breathe, but clearly with an eye to what Professor Jha said, playing a role in shaping global norms and being a globally responsible player. I think other examples of Chinese institution building could also fall into that category potentially. The Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank has only provided loans in concert with the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. There are reasons for this. China doesn't want to face the moral hazard. It doesn't want to be responsible for debts with countries that can't repay. There's leverage and power for lenders coming together. So while China's engaged in a great deal of free riding on the global system, there also is some evidence that we can build patterns of cooperation on these global issues because China has a stake in the global system and we're looking for help. Not black and white, but there is some mixed picture. In some areas, China's trying to shape or form institutions that might undermine the prevailing international norms, but in other cases, China is contributing, always in ways that serve China's national interest, but in a more positive way. When you look regionally, it's a much different picture. When you look regionally, and Dave pointed to some of this, you see a clear pattern of using coercion, not kinetic force of arms necessarily, but coercion to bend smaller states in the region to China's will. There's a long list, but just to add to Dave's, boycotting Korean companies to pressure Seoul not to allow the deployment of terminal high-altitude air defense, THAAD systems, embargoing rare earth metals to Japan to force Japan to concede to Chinese demands on the East China Sea on the Senkaku or Diaoyudai, banana and fruit export bans to the Philippines, rejection of and complete rejection of the tribunal's decision last summer about the Philippine case in the South China Sea. That is, in my view, revisionist behavior. It's not on the order of Russian revisionist behavior in Central Europe or the Middle East. Falls well short of that in terms of danger and threat and risk. Nowhere near Iran, but within its own region, I think, as one would expect historically from a rising power, China's engaging in revisionist behavior to a measurable extent. Now, I would caveat that by saying it is very different from Russia, very, very different. China depends very heavily on the global economy, on the U.S. economy, on an open and inclusive Asia-Pacific trading and economic system. China cannot afford the risk of confrontation with the U.S., particularly the domestic political risk and the risk to the economy. And China will try as much as it uses coercion to use enticement, inducement, to try to change that order. But I think that's what's happening. And the tell, as they say in poker, the giveaway, the tell, was President Xi's speech at the CICA conference about a new Asian security order. 2014, which was, if you go back and look at it, almost plagiarism. Plagiarism. As a professor, I don't say that lightly, because it's almost word for word what Mikhail Gorbachev said in Vladivostok in 1985 when he was making the case for a new regional security system without alliances, without blocks. I consider that a bit of a tell. But I don't think that, the caveats matter. I think that, I disagree a little bit with Dave. I do not think this is the post-Deng era. I think there are still elements of Dengism. I am told that President Xi Jinping in smaller council still refers to Dengism, was hesitant to use Deng because he thought it was viewed as sneaky, the famous hide and bide maxim. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's very clear in President Xi's interaction with Presidents Obama and President Trump that that element of Dengism, a stable U.S.-China relationship, remains essential. And confrontation with the U.S., for 1,000 reasons, is a bad idea. So I think the sweet spot for Chinese strategy is to try to maneuver the United States into agreement on a new bargain. Some people say a fourth communique. I don't think it has to be a communique, but a new understanding that to avoid the Thucydides trap, to avoid confrontation, the U.S. and China have to reach accommodation. And that accommodation would take the form of a bipolar condominium, an agreement between the U.S. and China to try to lock in a strategic relationship in which China is the privileged power in Asia. And that issues like North Korea, South China Sea will largely be resolved between the U.S. and China. The United States will not do what it does now, which is back up Japan, back up Taiwan, back up other regional powers. And I frankly think there are parts of this administration, as there were in the previous administration, who were kind of tempted by this. In the previous administration, it was because the global issues were so important to them that they didn't want to jeopardize that by confronting China regionally. I think for the current administration, it's a bit more complicated, but there's clearly a line of thought that China will help us with North Korea, and so on and so forth, so we ought to get the best deal we can. I think that's a huge mistake in terms of U.S. policy, and I don't think it's necessary to have stable and productive U.S.-China relations, because I believe that within the Chinese elite, there's a range of views. For example, when Xi Jinping promoted the Xinjin Dagua Guanxi, the new model of great power relations, you know, the original architect of that idea was Dai Bingguo, who included among the great powers, the Daguo, Japan and India. That fell off. The current leadership wanted a U.S.-China model with all the other powers in Asia as second-tier players. We've done surveys at CSIS, the last one was 3 years ago now, where we asked elites in 10 Asian countries, what is the order you prefer in Asia in the decade ahead, in a decade? You know, bipolar U.S.-China, multipolar, U.S.-led. Every country's elites, intellectual elites, had a clear preference. And for most U.S. allies and partners, it was U.S. leadership. The Chinese intellectuals and elites' answers were quite interesting because of the 5 scenarios we gave, none got more than 20%. Or more, yeah, so basically the highest was 20%. So the Chinese intellectuals and elites were completely divided, whether they wanted a bipolar condominium, a Sino-centric system, and so forth. And actually, the really fascinating thing about this survey we did, and you may have been one of the anonymous people who answered it, the really fascinating thing was the Sino-centric system was second least popular among Chinese intellectuals. But the least popular was multipolarity. Because multipolarity is how the Qing dynasty fell. It's multiple powers scrambling and conjures up images of Japan and so on and so forth. So I do think there's debate, and I don't think this is solid in China. There's no Beijing consensus in Beijing. I don't think we have to have a new model of great power relations and lock this in. I think we should be encouraging the debate and the discussion. So I'll end there. Thank you, Dean.